Good morning, everyone. How the heck are you doing? All right, you ready to go? The first subject you should be happy about. No, we're not going to talk about sex until later. But we're going to talk about longevity. Now, what I've observed in the 4 decades of my work that has been profoundly factual is that the only people that want to live a long time are happy at this point. If you're not happy, you're always looking for a way out. And sadly, I determined that many people who contract diseases, who worked very hard at contracting diseases, by the way, are using that as almost a suicide pact with themselves. That it's much easier to blame cancer, much easier to blame a disease, an emotional breakdown on your demise than it is to jump off the George Washington Bridge. And so the reality is that we bring, as Anna Maria led us at the very end of last night, to realize that more than 2,000 years ago, the very instinctual Asian physicians, the top spiritualistic instinctual physicians, realized that even the organs of the body were related to emotions. And when I first studied that, for a period of time when I was a macrobiotic, I thought it was nonsense, to be candid with you. And then I started to work with people, and as of this year, last year I should say, we determined that I've probably counseled and worked with 200,000 people, both at Hippocrates since 1980 when I've been the director, 1975 when I joined, and centers I developed and ran in Europe. And what I have learned is that they were so spot on about that, it's amazing. People who have liver disorders always have particular personalities. What's really weird, even mainstream conservative physicians I know closely, we all talk to one another and say, it's sort of an eerie feeling after you've done this long enough. When a patient walks into your office, almost always, I would say 7, 8 out of 10 times, you can determine what they have before they open their mouth, before you look at their paperwork. Because personalities bring disorder to us. But now today we're going to speak about longevity, but not all about nutrition, because nutrition is one part of living a long and healthy life, but there's many components to this. The one we just spoke about is by far the most important. Now, longevity is something that's quite achievable. Last night we gave you the statistical numbers that Stanford University, Cornell University, Oxford, and Cambridge all agree with. That if we took away the emotional state of a human and all of the environmental noxious elements that we now have, we would probably all live at about 140 years. Enjoying life without limits. So, to live a long life, you have to get rid of, what's that last word there? And who creates limits on you? You do. It's easy in our very crazy culture that we have in Europe as well as North America to blame others for your circumstance. Well, I'm too short, so I can't live a long time. I'm not as smart as my sister. Do you follow? And that way it breaks you down slowly but surely, giving you at least a failed comprehension of why you can't live a long life. So you've got to remove your limits. And limits are the most important. A long life is within the reach of all of us. Longevity is not merely an idea. It is an absolute reality for those who choose to be responsible for their lives and their world. So those of you that run around saying, things are so bad and I can't change, get your act together. The reality is you've got to take charge of your life. You want things to change, you've got to change yourself. And this is not some new age rhetoric I'm giving you. These are the laws of basic quantum physics. That mathematically everything works totally exactly the way it should at all times. The one enigma, the one abnormality is human perception. That's the only thing that's not working the way that it should, by the way. And the human perception is what prevents you from having a limitless life, an endless potential, which we're going to be speaking about tomorrow at the close, and build this up slowly but surely so that you have the under foundation to understand exactly how you can take your life to the place you need to have it, to a place of total competence, total responsibility, no blame, and understanding that you are totally in charge. The rare but refreshing occasions we have guests come through the Institute who already have that possession we know instantly that they're going to recover from their diseases. Many of you have received the magazine, if you haven't, the latest magazine, either via the mail if you're on our list or here in the last couple of days. It's on recovery. About 14 years ago, the guest came to us and said, listen, why don't you once a year take a handful of people out of the hundreds and hundreds that yearly report they've gotten on the diet and lifestyle, and now they've recovered from disease, and report them. So January 1st, every single year, this is the 13th year we're doing it, we put out the Recovery magazine. And in there you have story after story. One of the most poignant stories is a young lady. I happened to be in a large group about 3 times this size in Orlando about a year ago, and Anna Maria ran up and gave me a note and said, Eunice wants to speak. And I looked out and I saw Eunice, and she was a meek, quiet, Spanish-American woman, lovely woman, mother. And when she got up, I was surprised because we could hardly get her to talk when she was a guest at Hippocrates. And she said something that even surprised me, because it was only several months after she left the Institute, with advanced cancer throughout her entire body. And I personally had doubts that Eunice would be able to go home and follow through with this because she doubted herself. She was the old paradigm type of a woman who basically perceived herself as a mother and a wife more than she perceived herself as a person. Do you understand what I mean by that? And the empty nest women know what that means, because our culture sadly has just relegated women to one position that everyone's real comfortable with, seemingly a lot of women, being the wife and being the mother. So when she left, we reluctantly but hopefully believed that she could do it. And she stood up and she said, I went to the doctors who told me 6 months ago I was going to die, and they said, what has happened is a miracle. And she said, I tried to tell them that I took responsibility for my life and I started to eat different things. And they walked out of the office and said, if you want to talk about that nonsense, why don't you talk to the nurses? And she said, it's so sad, because if I could just get him, and she meant this from the bottom of her heart, if I could just get him to listen for a minute, can you imagine how many lives that oncologist could save? Just for a minute. Now, why would you have a world? It's not bad doctors, it's a bad system, by the way. I don't know anyone I've never met out of the 2,000 or so doctors that I could probably name by name that I've gotten to know well enough that we can talk to one another. And out of that, I would say about 1,500 of them are mainstream doctors, many of them, because of what we do, oncologists. I don't know one of them I can point to that say they're charlatans. I don't know one of those doctors that I can say went into this for money, because believe me, you don't go into medicine for money. You get out of high school and go to Wall Street for money. You don't go into medicine for money. And so when they were 18 years old and decided that they were going to go through a gruesome 12 years of education, that you're broken like a wild horse, literally, they did it for the right reason. I have no doubt about that. And when they go into the medical schools, what has happened is that they've been hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry. And that 50% of medical education globally, if you go in Peking, China, to become a medical doctor, 50% of the education is paid for by the very pharmaceutical industries. And the poor doctors of today have been relegated to be prescription writers, pharmacists, unless they have specialties. And what an impotence you start to feel after a while. Because if what has happened to you is if you haven't kept your mind open and haven't been on the cutting edge and haven't challenged yourself and hadn't said, let's learn, let's grow, let's develop, let's read the medical journals, let's see what the latest information is, then all you do every day is come in and write prescriptions for people. And that's not the bad part. The bad part is when it doesn't work. And then on this goes, and it perpetuates a sick system. When we talk about the health care system, what we have to talk about is a self-care system, not the health care system. How do we get people back to the self-care? How do you take care of yourself? Well, you basically have to start to evaluate who you are and what turns you on. And when you do that, you start to realize that longevity is possible for anyone. But why would you want to live a long time if you're not having fun? That flies in the face of common sense, doesn't it? So I can tell you one thing. Everyone I know that's 100 years old or more are having a darn good time. I have a friend that's 106, and nearly 70 years ago he was dying of liver cancer. And about 2 years ago I spoke to him, and I said, I've never asked you this question. Could you tell me why you think you're alive? He said, I get up every day trying to find new things I've never done before. Good friend of mine, we actually nicknamed her when I lived in Switzerland, Geneva, Switzerland, and I helped to develop a center called Foundation Soleil. We called her Happy. And when I first moved the Institute out of Boston, Massachusetts, down to West Palm Beach, Florida, that week that we had done that, they sent me the front page of the Gazette of Geneva, Switzerland. And on that front page, rarely do they put a color picture, but here was a color picture of Happy on her 100th birthday, hang gliding off the Alps. Not a joke. And it really perked me up because it was a tough move, down to Florida. The weather wasn't tough, but everything else was tough about it. And it was nice because all of my buddies, including Happy, rallied a couple of months after that. They all came to the Institute to support us. And I sat with Happy in our hacienda room where a lot of the conferences used to be held. And I said to Happy, oh, thank you so much. Oh, look at this young man. Give him a big hand. You're going to have a better lecture because of him now. I said to Happy, why in the world would you jump off the Alps and hang glide? And she smiled at me like, you poor boy, why would you ask me such a question? And she said, I've never done it before. Wouldn't you do it? And I said, frankly, Happy, I'm not sure I would have the courage to do it. Do you follow what I'm saying to you? That's why we live a long time. When we constantly challenge ourselves, find new things that make us happy, find new things that turn us on. So if you're ill, and if you have a perpetual chronic condition called malaise, and that condition results in biological disorder, you've got to find what is in your life that's not making you happy at all. Excuse me, just give me a minute for the wheatgrass here. Now you're going to have a much better lecture, I promise you. Graceful aging is our natural birthright. Only by living unnaturally do we deny it to ourselves and others. Now, it would have been nice if we could just destroy our own lives, but a lot of our actions today have a major ripple and domino effect. So if Exxon decides that they want to start to drill for more gasoline or ship more gasoline around the world or put faulty wells in the middle of the water, it has a major effect on the globe when these things happen. And so we no longer have what happened up until the last century, personal degradation. We have humanity that's degraded from your actions. This ripple effect is an amazing thing. And the only time we ever recognize how connected we are is when a traumatic global event occurs. The last one, of course, was right here in New York City with 9/11. And even your enemies at that point to the United States were touched and we unified under that. But do you recognize that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we're interconnected with all other human beings, all other life on this planet, and every word you say literally vibrates thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. Your consciousness does that too. Other times you can see this if you're a little bit conscious, is if you visit areas of the world or places in the world that are ritualistically relegated to spiritual places. As an example, every time I'm in Paris, France, which is a couple of times every year, I always try to go to where? Notre Dame. Because Notre Dame, although I'm not a Catholic, and although people go there for many reasons, there have been millions and millions and millions and millions of people that have gone to Notre Dame for one intent. What is that intent? To pray, raise their consciousness. And when you walk into Notre Dame, you can walk off the street of Paris, walk in there, it is palatable. You can feel it, you can see it, you can touch it. That the intent of that environment is what? To raise awareness. But can you imagine you could do this in your own home? That you can have an intent in your home to make it a sacred place, to raise your consciousness, to have a happy place. Most of you go home and it's a very unhappy place. You married somebody that you no longer know. You haven't raised your children because you haven't been friends with them, so they're enemies against you. And so when you go home, it's like a war zone, not a sacred place where you can raise happiness, health, and longevity, is it? And so we've got to change that. And what would it take? One serious conversation with those people you love that are there? And if you're having a problem with those people you love, it's because you don't love yourself. This process can be altered only by the one who confronts it, you. And you can change it only by making natural, life-affirming, positive choices. Don't sit and whine. Doesn't do any good for you or anyone else. You want change, you change. That simple. It's not easy. That's what we've been doing now for 57 years at Hippocrates. Every single Sunday, 52 Sundays a year, people come in, and many of them look like the deer who has the figurative lights from the car on them, like this. And they thought they were prepared for this. Obviously, these are courageous people. Because we are changing the entire paradigm of life. We're not just saying to you, by the way, you've got to give up pork chops and eat chicken. We're saying you've got to give up all animal-based foods. We're saying you've got to face yourself. You've got to challenge your reality. We're saying you've got to get on your knees and stick wheatgrass up your buns. We're saying you've got to get in a room with people that were strangers days ago and open your hearts and talk about things that probably you've never talked about with the most intimate people you have. And it is a rotor-rooter effect to bring you back to reality and normality. But people have the courage to do it. And what's amazing to us, and it's beautiful to watch, the humanity that occurs at Hippocrates is the humanity that's viable in your community, in your country, in your world, in humanity on a whole. And that humanity is inherent. We watch people from every corner of the globe. We right now have 15 countries represented at Hippocrates and the 100 guests that are there. Every age. Some have come there to lose weight, and some have come there to save their life. And they come together like brothers and sisters, like they've known each other forever, and they support and love one another. And the ones that are a little bit more feeble, they're holding and loving. And that healing process is amazing because we've created the venue for a sacred place. We cannot create sacredness. Only you can create sacredness. Remember that. There's no such thing as a sacred externalization. There's only internalization of sacred life. And so you want to raise your awareness, you raise your own understandings. Because there's nothing you don't know. The day you were conceived and the day you were born, you had endless potential. You are God. You are all-knowing. You are all-loving. And then all at once, your loving parents, if you had the great gift, as I did, to have loving parents, started to chisel away your hope. You can't do this, you can't do that. You're not as smart, you're not as tall, you're not as good looking, and before you know it, you start to buy into this, and you conform. So we become normal. First you choose to think positively, then you act in a way that is consistent with those affirmative thoughts. Too many people I see walking around trying to pretend to be Mary Poppins, and then they don't put it in action. I don't care if you walk around smiling all the time. I noticed that the top comedians, some that I loved very much, that just had you chuckle from the minute they opened their mouth, all had serious depression. So their coherency of creating positive thought and putting it into action wasn't there. So you've got to do both, not just walk around smiling all the time. Finally, you fuel your self-created, newly broadened horizons with a bountiful banquet of vegetarian offerings. Now, I will say this boldly, loudly, and I can give you the science behind it later, that you cannot be totally conscious when you slaughter death and bring it in, put it into your body, and make your body a coffin. It will lower the energetic potential for your brain and your hormones to function at the level they can, because consciousness is not just a mystical process, it comes from God above. It is a biochemical process that has to do with things like serotonin, dopamine, receptor sites, and we understand consciousness now. And now with electromagnetic frequency, some we use at Hippocrates that we didn't pioneer, but people like Dr. Monroe pioneered back 40 and 50 years ago, you can alter with electronics consciousness. There's a device that we use that reverses about 50% of depression that, by the way, you can buy and take home. If you do everything else right, it's several $100s that adjust neurons in the brain. And this is where the future of healthcare and medicine is going once they found a way to make enough money so they'd let it happen. At this point, they're not making enough money, so you're still in the old chemical paradigm. The history of aging. Even aging has a history. Don't you love that picture? You know, I don't know why in the 60s we had that type of mutton top sideburns. How many of you had that? I was really a swift guy. I had a belly about this big, mutton chop sideburns, and hair down to here. My mom loved me. Then when I said I'm giving up all meat and dairy, and I came home and I weighed about that much and I had hair down here, she couldn't quite figure that out. Our bodies constantly regenerate themselves. As developed cells complete their task, they are replaced by healthy new cells created in our bone marrow. Isn't that amazing? So this concept that I was taught in school, that there's a snapshot of what your health is completely irrelevant. The snapshot I take now, by the way, doesn't exist 1 second from now. Now, if you listened very closely and astutely last night, my wife said to you, stomach lining completely regenerates in how many days? 5 days. Parts of the brain, which I was taught at school, never repair. 2.5 days. One of the most shocking things when I was in school in the dark ages, they used to say, once the liver is harmed, that's it. Do you know every single day, listen closely, there are thousands of surgical procedures where they now cut more than 50% of your liver away if you have cirrhosis or hepatitis or cancer. And guess what? It grows back in how many weeks? 7 weeks. So we are wrong. There's not a snapshot of who you are because you're a chameleon. You're an ever-growing continuum of the universe and the way everything else works and the way that the sun is shining out there today and the way the hurricanes are created and the way the planet flows on its axis and the way the universes work, because we're not in one universe, and we'll get to that by tomorrow. We're in a multiple universe that now we have scientifically validated. There's no debate on this anymore for people who read current science. At the beginning of human life, we lived far longer. Oh, no, today we live longer than we've ever lived. Now let's review this and see if anyone's dumb enough to still believe that ridiculous statement. Yesterday I said very simply in the first 8 minutes I spoke to you that here in this country as well as Europe and Canada, that 100 years ago 3% at most of people contracted the disease we call cancer. Today we're telling you 50% of the population will contract cancer. And we anticipate by the year 2050 it will be 65 to 70%. And that's when I'm speaking at medical conferences and schools, they suggest to me, and I never do it, that I now talk about cancer as a chronic disease rather than a catastrophic disease. They want to change the mindset. It's no longer catastrophic. Everyone has it, so it's got to be manageable. And it's manageable, okay, because 93% of the people that are treated medically for cancer will eventually succumb to cancer and most die from it. Let me repeat what I've just said to you. These are statistics, by the way, the New England Journal of Medicine, British Journal of Medicine, Swedish Journal of Medicine, and Austrian Journal of Medicine I've read it in. That 93% of all people that are treated medically for cancer will succumb to cancer eventually. Now, what kind of a system is it in cancer? Now, if you look at the heroics of medicine, those of us that call ourselves doctors are frauds that are not ER doctors. The only guys and gals who really should call themselves doctors are ER doctors. They're doing real medicine, aren't they? Congratulate those people. They are brilliant, wonderful, heroic people that are in blood every day, that are saving lives and are in crises. The stress loads inside of those ERs, and that's why I suggested you go to your general hospital, the public hospital here, and sit and watch what goes on. It will humble you and open your heart and make you a much more loving person. These are real doctors. But how can you be an oncologist for more than 5 years? I'll give the young man or woman until their mid-30s after medical school to practice medicine. But after 5 years, you can't tell me you don't know that you're failing. You can't tell me you don't know you're failing on that one. And why do we have a system that's failing that nobody even discusses? And by the way, it's almost mandated by an unspoken law or written laws in this country, in all 50 states, that if oncologists step out of the realm of chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, that they have a real good chance of being brought in front of the Board of Medicine and potentially losing their license for not practicing what? Approved, conventional, mainstream medicine. Now, it would be different if the doctors said, look, we get a 50% success rate. Well, that's legitimate, by the way. But how about if you say we get a 7% success rate? Is that legitimate? How about if you went down to the car dealer and the car dealer said, this is a terrific car, but by the way, 93% of the time, people buy this car, it's going to break down at some point. What would you say to the car dealer? Or by the way, the suit or the dress you're buying, it usually lasts for a while, but eventually it explodes into fire, 93% of the time. I don't think those businesses would be in business very long, would they? But with guerrilla intimidation, where everything's fear, and you're talked down to, and you start, because you don't believe in yourself, to think, well, I'm not bright enough to know this stuff. I've got to turn my life over to this stranger, complete stranger that I never met before, because he or she has just shown me something in metric system. That's the scary part for Americans. When I was young, they tried to introduce the metric system into America. Forget it. We got rid of it in 6 months. We couldn't count in systems of 10. And so when you go to the doctor, of course, because when we're trained at school, they take on the light machine, it sounds like this. Remember that? And if you had cancer, they mumble something like, more than centimeters. Now, the average American thinks a centimeter is the size of Adelphi University. So if they say you have a 2-centimeter tumor, people completely flip out. And then, of course, they go to their family and other Americans who don't know the metric system, and they say, oh, I have a 2-centimeter tumor. And they say, oh, my God, it's a 2-centimeter. Then they call up, do you know George has a 2-centimeter tumor? Mary has? So this perpetual domino effect of negativity happens. And remember, the beginning of human life, we lived much longer. Now, how do they play with these numbers? Well, back when my grandmother was a little girl, there was something called infant mortality. And modern medicine has cleaned that up in good part. People had large families. They had 10 and 15 children. Remember that? Do you know that 1/4 of all children would die at infancy before they were 1? And modern medicine, with its diagnostic tools, thank God, have virtually wiped that out. Although America should be ashamed because we're way down on the list. Because in the ghettos of New York City, Washington, D.C., we still have a lot of little babies dying because they don't get diagnostic technology. Or we'd be, your neighborhood, by the way, you have hot stuff out here. They know when the umbilical cord's wrapped around the baby or the baby's breech turned in the wrong direction. So we're not killing babies from taking them out improperly before. So they play with the number. Now, if people died at birth and people lived to 100 years old, to make this real simple, the average life expectancy would have been what? 50. We get rid of infant mortality, it moves up to 78. Everyone gets excited until you're my age. I want to be 108. And basically says, well, gee, we live longer than we've ever lived. 50% of us have cancer. Diabetes is so rapidly moving forward, 2 out of 3 people contracting diabetes now are below 18. And it's type 2 diabetes. When I was at school, they used to call adult onset diabetes, that it's commonly contracted now at 10 years old. We haven't talked about autism, like Anna showed you last night. This alone should have us marching on the streets of the United States with posters until our government does something about this. When we go from 1980, where 1 out of 10,000 people were diagnosed with autism, and don't give me the idea we didn't know what autism was, we did. We knew what Asperger's disease was. And this year, 2013, we're changing the language on that too. We now talk about the autistic spectrum, because it's such an overwhelming disease, 1 out of 10,000 to 1 out of 88. And it's, by the way, that's the average boy-girl. It's 1 out of 70-something now with boys. We are in trouble. And I can tell you, they can spend billions of dollars, as they will, and they'll create the autistic associations, and you, just to feel better about your life, will write checks and send it in, and they'll waste it to try to find a drug to correct autism, rather than say, it's heavy metal toxic poisonings, chemical poisonings, and lack of harmony in the home. The psychological aspect of that is bad. What is this attention deficit disorder? It's a fraud. I don't believe there's really an attention deficit disorder. When I came home at 3 o'clock from school, my mother was there. I got hugged, I got kissed, and unfortunately, I was fed milk and pie or cake every day. But at least I felt really secure. Didn't I feel secure? Now kids come home, where's mom? Where you're stuck at school till 6 o'clock when mom gets out of her job. That insecurity can make a kid run around a classroom and ask for attention since mom and dad are not giving that to them. And how about the sugar intake? When I was a kid, we ate sugar. Today, my God, they almost IV sugar into kids at this point. There was no such thing called a computer in my generation. Today, you can't get a child off a computer. What do you think that does? What do you think digital does to the human brain? Does anyone even understand that part of it? When you see digital, it looks better or sounds better, but it's little squares, thousands, tens of thousands of squares that are for the first time in human history projected into the brain and cross-circuiting neuron effect and the way that neurons move. So now we have brains that are not working the way they should. And why I don't think attention deficit disorder is really a disease, because I've seen so many hundreds of people be able to reverse it once they start to change the cause of these things. And what is our answer for that again? Again, with the prescription writers, the poor doctors who were conned. You think you were conned by medicine. They were the real ones conned by medicine. Now they're paying about $1 million to go through medical school. They get out, they're glorified pharmacists, and many of them find out what that they're doing isn't helping. But many of them, because at that point, they're 40, 50 years old, and they're raising children, and they don't know, well, what am I going to do at this point? So they stay in something that they don't really feel good about rather than change or learn or add or improve. That's what we have to change. The further back we go, the more we were in harmony with nature. That's why we lived longer. Matter of fact, when I was a kid, I'm in great part Irish, I had these ants that looked like leprechauns. How many of you are Irish here? Did you have those ants too? They were about this big. And I used to be frightened of them when I was a kid.
They'd all talk. They had an Irish brogue. How are you doing there, Brian?
Do I have to see those ants? We have to go to the wedding. I'd always see them at wakes. That was eerie enough to begin with.
They'd all be walking around like this. Hello, how are you doing there?
One died at 106, and I can tell you she wasn't on the Hippocrates diet. But in their generations, they ate very little. And one thing we know since 1930, now with more than 2,000 studies, is every single time any legitimate organization does a study on why people live long, and when it relates to diet, they all say the same thing. There's never been a study that doesn't say. People who eat the smallest amount of the highest quality food live the longest. So you come here to learn how to get off meat and dairy. I'm going to tell you that eventually, it may not be now, it took me a long time, the real trick is to eat even less of this good food. Because we know one thing that nobody debates anymore in medicine unless they don't know what they're talking about, that when you eat less food that's of high quality, you will live longer. So one of the major reasons why in the Hippocrates diet people live longer, and those of us who have lived this way for a long time, we don't age the way the rest of the population does. I've just given you the biochemical reason. Now this is not debatable, by the way, because time and time again, globally at the top universities, every time it's been researched, the same conclusion has come out. Return to nature. The disease rate of people living in cultures more attuned to nature has always been low. Now, disease, this is an interesting word. Disease means disorder. Bottom line is, where do people die, or what do people die from in these cultures, the third world cultures? Not really diseases, infections. They don't die of cancer. When I was brought into a United Nations project and we went to Egypt, I was much younger and insecure because all of these very established doctors were there, and I was sort of the new guy on the block and didn't have nearly any credentials compared to these people. Didn't know a lot, and I kept asking questions. And I kept asking this one older doctor who had to be 75 at the time, tell me the cancer rate here. Tell me the cancer rate. He got fed up one day, and he sat me down. He said, listen, we don't have cancer here. That's something you develop in the West. How we die is from dirty water. He said, you thought you were smart in the West. You put chlorine in water. You don't die from microbes and amoebas in the water. You die from the chlorine, and you get cancer. Bingo. It hit me. I said, wow. So disease, I would rather think, is something that we've created. We've worked hard to create a disorder, a disorderly life, a disorderly lifestyle, where I don't consider a microbe a disease. We can put it into that category. I call it an unfortunate event that shouldn't have happened to begin with, and if money was involved, it wouldn't have happened to begin with. And when we know we can put ozone into water and kill everything much better than chlorine, and we don't do that, and when we know fluoride, which your Environmental Protection Agency in 1993 called a carcinogen, I will repeat that, Americans. Your Environmental Protection Agency in 1993, in writing, called fluoride a carcinogen. The next day, you would have thought they outlawed fluorine. We have more fluoride in the water today than we've ever had in the history of America. Every single country in Europe except Ireland has outlawed fluoride in the water. You know why? Because they know it is a carcinogen. How is it here we don't have the wherewithal to do that? How is it we don't have the wherewithal to do that? How is it, by the way, we don't tax out of business if they don't wise up the polluters? You and I have to have grassroots organizations and come together like this on weekends so we can be with like-minded people who have enough awareness to say, wow, something's really wrong. This should be led by our leaders. They should be saying to you, eat vegan diets. I mean, the day I knew this was shifting into the mainstream is the day I found out that former President Bill Clinton became a vegan. I said, if you had asked me the one man in America that would never be a vegan, it would have been Bill Clinton, right? He used to run, and after 10 miles of running, he'd end up at McDonald's. The Secret Service had an ongoing joke about Bill Clinton doing that. Do you follow? Now, Dr. Esselstyn, I said to him, tell me your conversation on phone with Bill Clinton. And he said, well, you know, remember, Esselstyn, a farm boy originally, smart guy, says, well, I talked to Bill Clinton, and I said, Bill, you know, people don't get beyond 3 bypasses. My experience as a cardiovascular surgeon is that you do 3 bypasses, and then that's it. Bingo, that's the end of the show. I said, what did he say? He said, nothing for the first time I know. He said it was dead quiet for about 15 seconds on the phone. And then he said, well, I guess if I have to eat some vegetables, I will. Now he's got to get Hillary onto that at this point. They're getting her ready for 2016. Living in harmony with nature has always been and will always be the only way to enjoy a long, full, fulfilling life. This is no mystical thing. You don't really need to come to Hippocrates to figure that out. You know, get into nature. Watch the way everything else works. I'm going to show you this extraordinary film I just saw recently when I was speaking at a conference, that this brilliant filmmaker, he must have the patience of God. You know, he goes out and he puts cameras out and waits in slow motion camera and gets things in nature that none of us would see unless it's done in slow motion in very odd places in the world. And you're going to see the way the rest of nature works. This will be the cherry we put on this figurative raw pie by tomorrow night. And you're going to see that the only enigma is human what again? Human perception. Your perception is what screws it up. Your perception is why you don't know what I'm telling you already. Remember that. All of this stuff is inherently truth. Many of us wrongly believe that aging involves cumulative degeneration of both the body and the will, as well as indecisiveness, loss of memory, and mental capacity, and relentlessly degenerating health. And the big boner for you is sexual vitality. You know, if I tell people dying of a disease that you can get well doing this, they don't listen as well as if I say your sex life will come back. Oh, okay. I'll drink the wheatgrass for that, especially the men. You know, we somehow, you know, our virility determines our importance, I guess, at that point. Modern aging, altitude is everything. Boy, is that not true. Leisure time was rare, work was exhausting, families were large, homes were humble and crowded, and household tasks were demanding and endless, and we were much happier. Now think about that. Do you know my grandmother's generation, my aunt's generations, they used to sleep with 5 and 10 kids in one bed with the mom and dad? And they were happy? They were happy when Dad came home and had the paycheck and they had enough. What is that? What's that one say? All right. We had the paycheck and they were happy enough to be there. And they didn't have television and they didn't have radio. They didn't have laptop computers or cell phones or smartphones or any of that business. But they had one another. And we don't have one another because we don't have us. And most of you don't even sit and talk to your children. You don't know your children. They sort of happen, that 10-minute joyride that you had, and then all at once his baby popped out that nobody ever taught you how to deal with, by the way. Great father, still alive today. The only thing he ever said to me, ever, about being a father is, you wait. 2 words. The most important job I'll ever do in my entire life, my very good father said, you wait. What kind of how many of you women were trained by your mothers to be a mother? Same show. What else is more important than that? The way you make a living? No. It's being a parent. Perpetuation of humanity is really why we're here. If you blow the smoke out of the room, it's not about the stuff, the economics, it's about the self. Do you get that? And those of you that think it's about the stuff, that's probably why you're sick. You can chase the stuff all day long. Stuff is easy to get, by the way. Self is much harder to get because you don't trust yourself. That's the problem. So buy yourself after all the deception that you've been putting on from the time you were a child, all the shortcuts you've taken, all the lying, the cheating, the stealing that you've done. You know it. You can't hide from yourself. So to trust yourself is a difficult thing. But instead of exhausting ourselves with activity, we destroy ourselves by the consequence of our activity. Pollution, destructive diets, large-scale destruction of the planet, and the way we distance ourselves from vital living. That's the punchline. So the message very clearly, and we're going to open for some questions on this subject right over here, again to the right side of the room, is when it comes to longevity, it's not first and foremost about diet. It's about what we talked about right now. It's about getting back to those very simple and basic things that may seem corny in this high-speed world of deception, but it's not so corny. I always say to young people when they come to me, think about who's going to end up at your funeral and spend your time with them now. Do you follow me? It's pretty easy to blow the smoke out of the room on that. When you say, well, my children should be there unless I'm really horrible. My husband or my wife should be there. My friends should be here. My real friends should be there. That's the people you need to focus in on. Not to say you shouldn't be understanding the rest of the world's important, but if you keep the ecosystem of your own reality as the foremost interest in your life, you then have a ripple effect of happiness, goodness, success, health, and well-being that moves out beyond your family to your community, to your humanity, as we discussed in the early part of what we've just said. So is a microphone set up here again so that we can... Okay, it's back here today. So anyone that's interested in talking about this particular subject, please stand here.
My name is Jose Franco. My question to you is this. I've read the Master Key System, Charles Haanel, and it's parallel to a lot of what you're saying. Do you see any holes in the strategy that the Master Key System has? Do you have any input on that?
Well, you have to remember, when we talk about systems, it would be like me diminishing what we do at Hippocrates to only the food. So I cannot say there's something wrong with it. I think that there's always something right with something positive. Even things that really I don't believe in at all ultimately is going to help. I mean, to give an example, if you look at certain kinds of lifestyles, you look at Atkins. Atkins was a fraud. And what angered me about Atkins is he was a brilliant, brilliant man. Out of the top 3 and most intelligent people I ever met, he was there. And when I would debate him quietly, he would always go back and say, well, it's better to give the people that, give them the meat so they're not eating the carbohydrates and getting fat and getting sick. I said, but you know that this creates cancer. He acknowledged. You know it creates cardiovascular. You know it creates diabetic conditions. And that was an excuse. Where, for instance, I do not agree at all with Diadamos, but I understand the integrity of the Diadamos with the blood type diet. And the father was persecuted. Most of you don't know, it's not the young man that you have learned about that wrote the blood type diet that was the man who created this. It was his father who was in Connecticut, a naturopathic doctor, and had to flee the United States because he was being arrested for helping people. This is 40 years ago or so. And his son, thank the Lord, became popular. Now, these are two good men that mean the right thing. They're utterly wrong, understanding biochemistry. No, your blood type doesn't matter. I'm a type O, for instance. The day I gave up animal foods, I started to flourish. And that's been 41 years ago now. But the reality is quite simple. You can't relegate something down to just food and diet. So any system that says you're in charge first and foremost psychologically and spiritually is where I'd like to start. Now, let's talk about the mundane things like diet. Religion becomes the diet, and it's sort of silliness. And what's really interesting to me, I go around the world speaking about diet, probably one of the most least interesting things in my life. This is just the way I eat. Let's get over that. Now let's talk about what's important. How you live, what you contribute, how you share, what turns you on, the passion in life, what contribution you want to make. That's it. So a lifestyle that includes that, I'm a big fan of.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm a very proud alumni. I went there in April, and I can say without any, failure that it's called the Life Transformation Program. It transformed my life for the better. And I went there with a cancerous tumor, and I wound up curing not only that, but multiple other things that I had dealt with my whole life, and I was told they were chronic. So if anybody wants to talk with me about it, I would love to share my story.
Especially young ladies. But
you keep plugging this for me.
I know.
But my question is actually, I heard you talk about parenting, and I know what a wonderful job you've done and Anna Maria has done because I've met your son and I've seen him in the magazines, and at some point, I'm wondering if you had any meaningful conversations that you felt were difference makers. They're up against so much, the entire society. I mean, is there anything you can share about that? And what was it that helped keep their mind frame in sync with you and Anna Maria?
I was a typical man, a typical father who thought that lying and being deceitful to my children was the right thing to do. And I think my oldest daughter, who now has become canonized in our family, she's given us 2 grandchildren now. I just spent Christmas week with her. We brought my little 4-year-old grandchild up to Whistler, and we taught him to ski, and we spent a week together during the holiday. And when she was young, she was the one I was so worried about. I didn't know if she'd go to jail or become president. I wasn't quite sure at that point. How many of you have one of those children? Yeah. So Danielle, I'm driving in the car. It's the only bad thing I do. I don't run around, don't drink, don't do any of the bad things, but I drive like a maniac. I just have to do something wrong, so that's it. And Anna Marie screams now. As she gets older, it gets worse. What are you going to be like when you're 80? I say, we'll die by then. We won't care. And she's in the back seat, Danielle, and she says to me, Dad, you ever smoke dope? And I had the Bill Clinton answer. They ask a man about dope or sex, we say no without thinking. Comes out of here, it doesn't even come out of the brain. No! And I'm still driving 80 miles an hour, and I'm an hour down the road, and I realize, wait a minute, now she's going to be 18 some point. She's going to realize I smoked a whole load of marijuana. Plus that, she's going to realize I was a liar at that point. So I said, I lied to you. She said, I knew. I wanted to see what you'd say. That conversation taught me, rather than me, the father, teaching them, I got that one conversation when my daughter was 12, who's now 30, that children are truthful. They're truth tellers. They don't know about deceit and deception. And so you've got to relate to them in a way they understand. So I realized I've got to explain to my children, this isn't what you have to do. My father would say to me, you do this if you live in this family. Why? Nobody ever told me. And so you resisted doing that. I taught my children why you should eat this way, why exercise is important, why contribution and kindness is more important than what we get. And it works most of the time, but they get influenced, as you said, by culture, other children, etc. We had a situation recently where, this family that's very open-minded, and the last people in the world, white people, that I would ever say were prejudiced, their child started to go home and talk about black people. Now, I know this family. These are civil rights activists, white people. And all at once, they have a child that's becoming a racist. And they sit the little boy down and they say to the child, "What's going on?" And he was reluctant to say what was happening. But at school, some of the white kids who learned it where? In their families, at home, started to come and mimic what dad and mom were saying and started to beat up. So what they did to the child is they said, now you've got to stand up and be courageous enough to help the people that they're beating up on. And he did it, and he came home, and what a transformation it made. But the average person would have yelled at the child and said, "You can't do that, we don't believe in that," and that would have been it. They explained to the child why that was wrong. So truth, honesty, communication, you're going to learn far more from your children than you'll ever teach your children. That I learned. You'll learn so much. They're so gifted, so beautiful, so godly, close to that source that you and I have lost. We're going to have to work hard to get back to. Good question.
Hi, Dr. Bryan. Just wanted to thank you for being here this weekend. My name is Greg Sessa, and I am planning on attending the Life Transformation Program this winter. This is more of a general question, which is probably more appropriate for the end, but I had an opportunity, so I wanted to ask it now. If one were to live somewhat of a lifestyle where one travels quite a bit, whether it be for family or for work, how does one go about maintaining the lifestyle?
Right.
I just would find that so difficult, and if you're staying in hotels or you're on a vacation, I'm all for giving this my 100% effort, but even a 100% effort is not going to work if things are not available to you. So how do you go about maintaining your lifestyle? I know you travel quite a bit, obviously, and if you could just give us some insight into that, that would be wonderful.
Last year, I traveled 200 days. This year, I'm going to cut that way back. I never deviate. And there's one simple answer that always applies. You need to focus in on what's important, and that's self and survival. Remember those two S words, not stuff, it's self and survival. You need to commit to self, and you need to follow through. Now, nowhere on the planet Earth do I ever go that you cannot live this way. Nowhere is this not available to you. And it becomes ever increasingly easy as you become more confident and comfortable in living this way. I'll give you a story. My assistant, who's just incredibly good, she's my second mother, I say. She always puts in my packages as I'm going out somewhere for 2-3 weeks lecturing, Happy Cow references. How many of you know about Happy Cow? Write this down if you don't. Happy Cow for all of us is just a gift. And she said to me, "I'm going to give you a Happy Cow for this place, you're going to stay in Paris." I said, "Oh, no, I don't need that. I go there all the time. I know where to go in Paris." And so when I got into the hotel room, I go day by day, or it would be overwhelming. I opened it up, and there's Happy Cow, and I get a little fussy. "Oh, why did she do that? I know where to go here." And I looked at it, and don't you know, there was a biological store, an organic, 100% organic store, on the same street, on the same side, a half a block away. I passed 1,000 times and never saw it. So this is really easy. In third world or very poor countries, especially where they're warm, you can get juice bars all the time. Now, I'm not going to get greens there, so I buy the greens, I bring it, give them the same 10 cents, and I end up with a green juice. If you really are going to a primitive place, unlike most of us, we're doing this for business, I don't most of the time, you have sprout bags that in plastic bags, as you're in a business meeting, they don't know it, but your lunch and dinner is growing there. So this is really abundant. It's all about you, confidence, self-respect, survival, and you do it. And it becomes easier and easier and easier and easier. Once you like yourself enough, you'll never deviate from doing what's good to keep yourself alive. That's it.
Hi, my name is Anastasia. I have a question. I had my son about 2.5 years ago, and only after the fact I found out that I had mercury and lead poisoning. And I started to do IV chelation, ozone for myself, but what can you say about how much of that stuff gets transferred to fetus in utero, and how to cleanse that now?
It's not a defined science. I've seen many mothers who were really contaminated with heavy metals, and then when we've tested the children, I may be able to articulate on 100 children, I would say 70 of them weren't that bad. 30 out of the 100 were as bad or close to as bad as the mother. Never as bad, though. Close to as bad. So the odds are for you with your child. Now, what we have learned over the decades is that chelation is cute and wonderful and expensive, but what really works better than anything, 2 times better than anything, is infrared saunas with large amounts of pure water. Remember, yesterday we talked about distillers or air extraction units being the only water people should consider now, unless you have $50,000. I can give you the number of a guy that can come put a full house unit in your home, take out the drugs, the pharmaceuticals. But that would be it. Copious amounts of water, infrared saunas on a daily basis, 20, 30 minutes a day. Like 2 hours today I was at the gym, 20 minutes of that was in a sauna. I don't go anywhere in the world anymore that they don't have gyms and they don't have saunas. It's 7 days a week for me that I do that. Then you need to take the green algae. You could take blue-green, but it's more expensive, so why? It doesn't do any better. Chlorella, and take large amounts of that. Somebody your size, 60 to 100 a day of those little pills. And I assure you, that will come out between the cracks and crevices. It takes time to do it, but the longest I ever saw it take is 18 months in very severe cases. And sadly, what she's talking about, many of you sitting here are not congruent with the idea you have that problem. Where you live, Long Island, was a dump site for factories from New York City. I don't know how many of you know that. And why the cancer rate here is much higher than many other places in the world and in the country is because this was a dump site. Here and in the grassland of New Jersey. This is where they would take barrels, there was no environmental protection at that point, and put everything from radioactivity to paint to chemicals out into these marshes at that point. So you're going to see larger amounts of that in the Northeast. When I was a kid growing up in this area, they thought I was cute because I could identify the odor of the factory. Rather than say, this is strange, we smell the factory. They used to say, look at Brian, he knows what, that's DuPont or whatever it is. You know. So we all have this stuff in us, and that's why even healthy people, we need to constantly do things like saunas, eat right, make sure you're eating organic food, exercise. The more you sweat, the more what?
Do you do sauna every day?
Every day. I don't go. This last year I noticed I missed 7 days and I was angry. I had to get on planes at 4 or 5 in the morning or something and I couldn't do it. You know, the sauna wouldn't open until 7 or something. But every other day I do it. And at home I put not only the normal sauna, but an infrared. And that's the best way. If you have a normal one already, stick the infrared elements in. And the best companies now are Clearlight, and I just had a meeting 3 days ago with Sunlightened. Sunlightened now has also made one that is low, almost non-existent EMF. One has no EMF, the other has non-existent EMF. And that's the next technology where it's moved. Sunlightened or clear light.
You know, a friend of mine just told me he bought a heat house. It's like a I guess, silvery-looking.
Yeah, you can buy one that's inexpensive. Several $100s you can buy that. And if your space is a problem and economics are a problem, certainly do that. If one could pay a little more, probably 3 times more, it's better to get a stationary one because you'll use it more. These things I see rip after a while.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jerlene Stavrinos, and I was listening to a lecture with Brenda Davis, and she raised a question about children and raw food diets, and I wanted to see where you stood with that.
Well, where I stand is with incredibly healthy children. Not one of my children ever, even though several went through colleges, ever missed a day of school sick. I've helped hundreds and hundreds of families when they were raising children this way. And if you're on the Hippocrates diet, it's radically different than many of the pop culture raw food diets. Most people out there today, because you really don't want to change, you want to just have a label of being a good eater, are thinking, you know, raw cacao, agave syrup, and mango juice is a raw food diet. You cannot sustain on that. The kind of diet that you're learning about this weekend, children flourish on it. Highest protein, highest nutrition, makes the brain work more, detoxifies the body. Intellect goes up, IQs go up. We can give you the science in every bit of this business. And so if you're a competent parent, you do this. If not, you listen to philosophers and theologists and not look at a 57-year-old organization that has the highest track record on the planet Earth's history of reversing catastrophic disease. It's your choice. Okay, we're going to take a short break, and we're going to dance for just a minute, and then we're going to come back for a next segment.